Okay, so welcome to the Women in Buddhism class. So when I started practicing Buddhism, practicing Zen in 1976, I'm certifiably an old lady, we out in the so-called West, America, Europe, had this idea that Buddhism in general and Zen in particular was basically a male domain. We knew that there were obviously women devotees, because temples won't run unless you have women bringing flowers and cooking food and stuff. But we didn't think that women had any serious role to play. And this was an example of our imperialistic blindness, that we had no idea of the rich heritage that we had, in fact, inherited. I remember around I guess it would have been 1978 or 79, meeting Gary Snyder, and he was visiting Lawrence, and he was very excited because they had had a sesshin, a meditation retreat, in which half the participants were women. And he was sure that this is the first time this had ever happened in the history of Buddhism. I mean, we were like so stupid. And it's not, it's really not. Women were present from the very beginning. And in a sense, their presence was taken for granted. And when I say in a sense, what that means is whenever women are mentioned, it's not like, oh, look, a talking dog. It was like, they're just mentioned, like nothing special. Like, okay, it's woman, nothing special about it. They're just there. So the presence is absolutely taken for granted. And in all of the sutras that have this part of them, there's this fourfold Sangha. So whenever the Sangha is invoked, there's always this fourfold Sangha. And the fourfold Sangha is monks, nuns, laymen, laywomen. Now, unfortunately, there is a hierarchy: monks, nuns, laymen, laywomen. There's a hierarchy there. But the fact is, all four are considered part of the Sangha, and the Sangha is not complete unless all four are present. They did not have a notion of trans or non-binary. You're either male or female, but anyway, that's how it went. And there's an article that I came across by art historian Chiyun Lillian Kwan, who's Korean or Korean American, and the article is called Nuns, Donors, and Sinners, Images of Women in Goryeo Buddhist Painting. So the Goryeo Kingdom was one where Buddhism really flourished, an early Korean kingdom. And here's the quote: "Extant woodblock prints and silk paintings often depict women as recipients, practitioners, and patrons of the Buddhist faith. They appear in the form of taking the tonsure, that means becoming a nun, mingling with monks or nuns, commissioning Buddhist images, or receiving punishment in the underworld after death. Whether on woodblock print or in fine color on silk, images of women are shown with equal prominence as participants in the support and practice of Buddhism, and as subjects to judgment in the underworld bureaucracy under similar conditions as the men." There was this court of 10 kings, that's the underworld bureaucracy. "Karmic reward and attribution is portrayed in a perfect meritocracy regardless of gender, whether it be accumulating good karma by offering donations or receiving punishment for past wrongdoings. Rebirth in the 6 paths also neither emphasizes one sex over the other, as the 2 possible gender forms appear with equal consistency. As such, images of the Goryeo Sangha in Goryeo Buddhist paintings allocate equal emphasis on both the male and the female, possibly reflecting the Goryeo society as described in the text." This was an era, by the way, of queens. Not as in married to the king, but as in queens. What is remarkable, however, is that while the Buddhist Sangha may be represented by both sexes, they were ultimately framed within a system governed by patriarchy. And that is how it is. I mean, that says it better than anything anyone else could say. There is this, women are there, they're taken for granted, but they are functioning in a system that is deeply shaped by patriarchy. So that's where we are. So let's talk about some of the negatives. Patriarchy rules the day. There's some places where that happens now, no surprise. But back then, yes, patriarchy pretty much ruled the day. In some Buddhist texts, women are seen as a distraction. You know, hide your eyes, boys. So, you know, if a woman is in a temple, then the men can't concentrate, right? So that's a big thing, this sort of emphasis on purity, and women are a distraction from purity. And I'll tell you later about a Japanese nun who really exemplifies having to deal with that. There's this belief, it's not in all of the sutras, but in many places it's believed that you can only be enlightened if you're in a male body. So women cannot be enlightened in a woman's body. And I'll talk about some examples that question that. Women are limited to subordinate roles, even roles as servants in the temples. And I'll talk about that some more. There are 8 special rules that women monastics need to take. And I should add, in Sanskrit, the men are bhikkhus, the male monastics, and the women are bhikkhunis. But in Korean, they're both sunim. In Korean, they use the same word for male and female monastics. But here are the 8 special rules. So you have to take like hundreds and hundreds of precepts. But then the 8 rules are: a nun must give homage to a monk, no matter how new he is or how experienced she is. And that's often stated as: a nun of 50 years must bow to a monk of 1 day. During the rainy season retreat, a nun cannot stay where there is no monk. Now, in China, a lot of that stuff started to be ignored. In China, the nuns had much more autonomy. In particular, the thing that are during a certain season, a nun needs a monk around, they ignored that. Every 2 weeks, a nun needs to ask monks about important ceremonial duties. That's something else that sort of fell away in China, but obviously it puts the monks in a leadership position. Confession after the rainy season must be made before both monks and nuns. And this idea that monks need to repent only in front of other monks, but nuns need to repent in front of both monks and nuns, is a kind of theme. A nun who has committed an offense must be disciplined by both monks and nuns. So the nuns don't have the autonomy to discipline their own. They have to bring the monks in. And again, this is the kind of thing that in China was ignored. But from the beginning, you know, these were the 8 rules. And even now, if you become a nun, you have to abide by, you have to at least state these 8 rules. Nun ordination is received from both orders. And this is extremely crucial. And I'll get to that in a minute. Nuns cannot insult or ridicule a monk. Well, the monks can ridicule and insult nuns. And nuns cannot correct monks, but monks can correct nuns. Okay, when you hear some of the stories of these Chinese nuns and these Korean nuns, it's really obvious they didn't pay much attention to that, but that's one of the 8 special rules. Now, the nun ordination is really critical, because what happened was when the women's orders died out in Southeast Asia, in Theravada school, Sri Lanka, they died out in Tibet. They remained vital in China and Korea. They were sort of there in Japan, but Japan has a funny thing because they don't really take the full, starting in the 19th century, they didn't take the full Vinaya, so this doesn't quite apply to them. Where a nun's order died out, if a woman wanted to become a nun, she had to find another nun to make her a nun. I think it's 5 monks and 5 nuns. And so where the lineage had died out, how could she do it? There was no one to help her with it. So what happened was Korea and China and Taiwan began to play very important roles in reviving the Theravada nun sangha and the Vajrayana, the Tibetan nun sangha. So women would go to those places to take full ordination, but those were not necessarily respected back home. So the full ordination of Tibetan nuns and Theravada nuns is really very recent. It's like I think it's sort of towards the end of the 20th century to have women who could take full ordination, not just partial ordination, and really be respected as full members of the monastic sangha is a very recent thing, but it stayed strong in the Mahayana countries of Northeast Asia, especially China and Korea and Taiwan, of course. So, okay, we've got that. And then the other thing that made things very hard for women was gaslighting. What are you complaining about? What are you talking about? Where's your equanimity? Where's your acceptance? What's wrong with you? There's nothing to see here. This is just your karma working out. Don't worry about it. Next life you'll be a man. What are you complaining about? You must accept your karma. That, and that is pretty big in a lot of places, or was pretty big. I think it probably still is. Any woman who's in a career where there are not a lot of women is very familiar with that. What do you mean your office is smaller than the other offices in the department? What's wrong with you? You have a nice office, that kind of thing, right? And a lot of the work in feminism in the latest sort of 70s, 80s, 90s of the 20th century was documenting that, well, actually, no, there actually is something going on here. But so that's is sort of gaslighting. So those are the negative things. On the other hand, there are a lot of positive examples in the sutras of clearly enlightened women, and especially the Avatamsaka Sutra and the Lotus Sutra. I'm going to talk about those and others as well. And from the beginning, women were active as teachers and they were active as patrons. And I'm going to talk about that later too. Women's institutions could be very strong and very vital, and at times more so than the men. At times, women monastics were regarded as more sincere and less corrupt than the monks because they had less to gain from monasticism. So a man becomes a monk and he can rise to a position of power in society by being a monk. And he can have, if not personal wealth, he can live in an organization which is wealthy, and so he has like the nice things around him that wealthy monasteries might have: beautiful art, really high level, monks' clothing, good food, etc. Whereas women didn't have those perks. And so if a woman becomes a nun, then that shows a certain sincerity. She really has nothing to gain from it. Maybe she has an abusive husband to escape, which is another function that nuns' temples serve. But she doesn't. It's not like the kind of corrupt temptation that monks were faced with. In fact, edicts designed on negative perceptions could actually strengthen the status of women. So, for example, in early 20th century Korea, the Japanese were in charge. They'd invaded, they'd taken over the country, and they wanted to, Buddhist monasticism, any kind of monasticism is always a threat to whatever government because it has a certain independence from politics. And so they wanted to weaken the monasteries. And so what they did is they ordered the male monks to marry. Now, not all of them did. And after the Japanese left Korea, then there was a big fight in the Jogye order, and the celibate monks won. And the other monks had to form their own order. But they tried to convince the monks to marry. But because of sexist ideas, the nuns were not allowed to marry. So when people were trying to get Korean Buddhism back, the nuns were considered leaders because they had never been tempted to marry. They had a certain integrity that the monks were not perceived as having. So sometimes these negative edicts actually serve to strengthen the women. And the biggest thing is the teaching that all beings have Buddha nature. So there's this egalitarianism that is built into Buddhism, which is one of the reasons why Confucian governments would often try to stamp out Buddhism, because there's this inner egalitarianism in Buddhism. All beings have Buddha nature. So that's the good stuff. Let's talk for a minute about iconography. I should ask, are there any questions? Okay, so let's talk for a minute about iconography. So you go into a Zen center, a Buddhist temple or whatever, and of course you see a Buddha. Actually, that's not of course, because some of the Japanese, they don't have a Buddha statue anywhere. But, you'll have a Buddha, you'll have maybe bodhisattva statues, you'll have maybe a temple painting, like we have a temple painting. You'll have all of this iconography there. If you look at the bodhisattvas, well, they're standardly, with some exceptions, presented as male. They are also standardly genderless. You don't see muscles. Their affect is really sort of non-binary. That's how their affect is. And they'll often paint like little tiny mustaches so that you know that they're really men. But there's this kind of non-binary aspect to most of them. Kuan Yin Bosal, is, according to one legend, transformed from a Chinese princess. So very female. Also, simultaneously, is the South Asian male Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, but always presented as very feminine. So people really see Kuan Yin as a female figure. I remember a long, long time ago being in the Nelson, and one of the docents come by with her little, people that she was giving a tour, and she pointed to the gorgeous Kuan Yin statue, which if you've never seen it, you have to see it, and said, "This is the goddess of mercy." And I go, "No, it's not the goddess of mercy, it's the bodhisattva of compassion." But, I think I even said something, Stan was like, calm down. But Kuan Yin is very feminine. Samantabhadra, the bodhisattva of action. You think action, oh, Samantabhadra. And he's the main bodhisattva of the Avatamsaka Sutra, also is presented iconographically as somewhat feminine, often depicted on a white elephant, which is conflated with the elephant that Queen Maya dreamed impregnated her. So Samantabhadra also is presented as fairly feminine. The most masculine presentation of bodhisattva in conventional imagery is Jijang Bosal Ksitagarbha, and that's the one, with the big staff and sort of the green hair, and presented as a male monk. But Ksitagarbha means earth womb. This is the earth womb bodhisattva, and I find it kind of amusing that the earth womb bodhisattva is the one who's presented as the most masculine. Okay. In the temple paintings, sometimes you will see a few women in the background, way in the up with minor characters that don't have names. And one of the temple paintings in Providence Zen Center has, I think, 2 women in it. We don't have any in ours. So, okay, so that's the iconography that you see in the temples. So let's talk about the nuns. So Mahapajapati was Buddha's stepmother, the woman who actually raised him, the woman he would have called mother, because his first mom died when he was, 10 days old or something. She led the court women for 150 miles to Vasala, where the Buddha was preaching. to beg to be allowed to become monastics, to ordain. Ananda interceded with the Buddha because Mahapajapati could not ask him directly. I don't know why, I can imagine. And Ananda interceded 3 times. And on the 3rd try, it's like these ladies, they've walked 150 miles on the hot, dusty plain, wearing these, they're already wearing the monastic robes, and you're not going to give them a chance. And Buddha said, well, if we ordain women, then instead of our practice lasting for 1,000 years, it will only last for 500. And of course, this was like 2,700 years ago that he supposedly said that. So, but anyway, eventually the Buddha said, okay, they can do that. And these early nuns, as I said, their poems are in the Therigatha, which there are other translations of the Therigatha now, but the first Buddhist woman also has biographies, and I think there's maybe a more contemporary one that does that too. And these poems are very interesting. They're very fearless. They're very strong. I'm about to look them up. They're very strong. You have a sense of the strength of these women. They have some very female imagery about husbands and kitchen stuff and things. But at the same time, they have a lot, in those days, people didn't try to be original when they wrote. They used a lot of stock phrases. You were supposed to do that. And much of what they wrote was very similar to what the male monks wrote. So you have the women's poems and the men's poems. And they're the sort of stock phrases are very similar. So it's not like there's a genre for women and a genre for men. It's more like the women had different circumstance. Let me read you 2 of these. Here's Isadasi describing her life before ordination. And again, this is something no man would have written. Morning and evening, I bowed to the feet of my father-in-law and mother-in-law. If I saw my beloved, his sisters, his brothers, or even his retinue, I trembled and gave up my seat. So that gives you an idea of what lives of women were like. And then here's Muta's poem, Free, I am free. I am free by means of the 3 crooked things, mortar, pestle, and my crooked husband. I am free from birth and death, and all that dragged me back. So these particular 2 poems are very particular. No man could have written them. But as I said, if you read through the rest of the poems, you'll see that many of them have these stock phrases about awakening and seeing, awakening, being free, being liberated, that are exactly the same as the men's phrases. All right. There were a number of major teachers of the time. Mahapajapati herself, Patakara, Dhammadina, Kema, Upalavani, Kisagotami. She's the one with the mustard seed. She was actually a cousin of the Buddha, and her child died, and she was dragging her child's corpse around with her because she couldn't believe her child was dead. And finally she came to the Buddha, and he said, if you can find a house where no one has died, then bring me a mustard seed from that house. And of course, she couldn't do that. And then she understood, and then she became a nun. And these women were very individualistic. Dhammadina was a great preacher. Kema was a great administrator. Upalavana was a great magician, and so on and so forth. So these were not like sort of an anonymous kind of background. These women were vital, and they were acknowledged, and they were very individual. So let's move on to China. The first women's temple in China was in 312. This was about 200 years after the men's first temple. But there was no full ordination until 357. They had to bring in nuns from Sri Lanka, which at the time had a vital nun sangha, to give ordination to the women in China, with, of course, male monastics in China also. As I mentioned before, Chinese monastics had much more freedom than South Asian and Theravadan. For example, all the monastics handled money, nuns could travel alone, etc. There were some women who were honored as teachers, and there were a few in the Chan lineage charts. Depending on which lineage chart you look at, they're between 5 and 14. And when I say the lineage charts, I don't mean going into the modern era. I mean the classical ones that go into up until like the early 20th century. Monks and nuns did not generally practice together, but they had many encounters. And during formal occasions, you'd have the monks sitting in front, the nuns sitting behind them, the male laymen sitting behind the nuns, and then the female laywomen sitting behind the male laymen. That's how it was done. In Korea, they didn't know what to do with the quantum school of Zen because we don't make those distinctions. They had a lot of trouble dealing with us. The nuns' temples, despite the fact that they were nominally connected with some kind of male teacher, they were fundamentally independent. And there's one temple in Korea that I visited, one nun's temple. You know, we have these trips. There's going to be another one coming up in the fall of this year, 2023. Whole World is a Single Flower. And when they're in Korea, we take these tours of temples. And there's this one nun's temple where they are so independent, they do a 3-year kilche. 3 solid years of retreat. Okay? So, anyway, pious nuns were held up as examples, for example, the lives of the nuns, 11th century. But one of the things that happened, so you want to know, how do we hear about these, especially Chan teachers and, Zen, Son? You hear about them because someone recorded what they said, someone collected their letters, someone wrote down their sermons. And these things resided in the men's temples and also in the women's temples. But the men were the ones who were widely read. They were the best sellers. And the women's records just sort of stayed in the temples, in the women's temples, and were not disseminated as much. And so that's one of the reasons why we fools in the mid-ish, late-ish 20th century had the idea that there were no women teachers in Buddhism, and especially Zen, was because we simply didn't know about the women's records, but they were there. So, you can go online and you can find the record of Unmun, you can find the Lin Shi record, you can find, Huang Po's letters and sermons, you can find all this stuff, but you won't find that for women, because it's just, they just didn't make it out there, but they were there. And there's some people, especially Miriam Levering, have done incredible work unearthing some of these records and restoring these women to us. Let's see. By the 9th century, there were 50,000 approximately Chinese Buddhist nuns and about 73,000 monks. And then there was the incredible persecution. It lasted only about 2 years, but about 1/3 of all monastics were forced out of monastic life. You want to know why the temples are in the mountains? That's one reason, to avoid persecution. Buddhism was brought to Japan by Korean nuns. Isn't that nice? And the first person in Japan who converted was an aristocratic teenage girl. So, isn't that nice? Okay. Nuns were established throughout the South Asian, Central Asian, and East Asian Buddhist world. But as I said, the nuns' lineage died out in Tibet and in South Asia. And it was Chinese, Taiwanese, and Korean nuns who were instrumental in bringing them back. How many of you looked at the article on the nuns in Nepal? It's a very cool article. If you haven't already, you should look at it. So basically, it's about these nuns and their Tibetan-style Buddhism, the Vajrayana, who only could become full nuns, I think, at the beginning of this century, maybe the very end of the 20th century. Not for very long have there been a full nuns lineage restored in Vajrayana Buddhism. And these nuns, they practice Kung Fu. They're very independent. They're really fantastic. And so this was, sent around to the American Zen Teachers Association. And most of us had already seen it in the New York Times, and everyone said, oh yeah, this is great, great, great. And then one of the members wrote this note, who said, I've spent a good deal of time in Nepal, and I've been privileged to meet a number of Buddhist nuns and lay women practitioners who are doing wonderful work. In particular, I think of a group of nuns who were among the first Nepalese women who were able to receive full Theravadan ordination. So this is Southeast Asian Buddhism. So it's interesting, in Nepal, Theravada is also very, very popular. That's Southeast Asian Buddhism. And would be in full charge of their own place. They bring in teenage women whose families have sold them to street pimps. They shelter and educate them during their teen years, although they have them dressed like nuns to keep them from being harassed when they leave the temple. They give them free choice when they turn 18 to pursue a secular life or to begin the process of joining the order. This is actually a very traditional role that the nuns' temples took, and Grace Shireson in her Zen Women talks about this quite a bit, that women who are abused, women who have been trafficked, women who have been widowed and have no possessions because of the, suddenly live in dire poverty, would be taken in by the nuns' temples and sheltered and cared for, and some of them would become nuns and some of them wouldn't, but they would still be able to be supported. And some of them would be supported to the extent that they could then live outside, and some of them would have to remain within the temple because of the social structures around them. Sadly, though, he goes on, in rural areas, the position of Buddhist women in temples is not much above slavery. I met a wonderful 16-year-old Buddhist nun in Muktanath, very bright and articulate, who told me she was in the temple against her will. Her family owed a daughter to the monastery. So that's very interesting. What does that mean? That means that these monasteries have a very feudal relationship to the town. They have a certain particular kind of power. So the family owed a daughter to the monastery, and though they had wanted her to pursue higher education, they didn't feel they could cross the village lama. So she and the other women were obligated to cook and clean and serve the monks without receiving any education, not even instruction in Buddhist practice. Still, she told me she was grateful that another traveler had informed her about the 3 sick noble truths. So, of course, they're 4 noble truths. So that tells you that she was not given very good education even on that simple thing. This thing about the nuns being servants, in some sense slaves, to monks actually goes back very far. And in many of the temples, the women who could take partial vows would have this kind of life of servitude. Their job was to serve the monks or to serve senior nuns. And in Women in Korean Buddhism, Women in Korean Zen, this book by Martine Batchelor, the nun, Song Gyang, that was how she started her monastic life, as a young girl, basically being a servant to an older nun. And she begged and begged and begged to get a true monastic education. And finally, because Man Gong, who's my great-great-grandfather in the Dharma, Man Gong was a great champion of women. And so Man Gong took her under his wing, and she was able to then become this great nun. But otherwise, she would have lived out her life, serving this older nun until the older nun died, and then she would have found some young girl to be her servant. That's how it would have gone. So the idea that nuns should have the same education as the men, that was something that died out in a lot of places. In a lot of places it stayed, but in a lot of places it also died out and had to be, and is still being restored. Okay, are there any questions? All right. So, women in the sutras. There are lots of women in the sutras. I'll just mention a few. Let's see. There's a sutra of the Buddha teaching the 7 daughters. And so this is about 6 of the daughters of King Kiki are reborn in the time of the Buddha to become some of the most famous nuns of the Theravada: Kema, Upalavana, Patachara, Bhaddakundakaseka, Kisudgatami, and Dhammadina. And typical of Mahayana extravagance, several of these daughters are described as having lived lives of celibacy, that is, through life after life after lifetime, for 20,000 years. The Mahayana is great. No limits, man. No limits. 20,000 years, you were born a celibate nun? Sure, why not? Okay. Then there's the Naga King's daughter in the Lotus Sutra. And this is very interesting. So in the Lotus Sutra, this 7-year-old, I think, this little kid, this Naga King's daughter. So the Nagas are like these snakes, snake bottoms, and, human tops or dragon bottoms. Nagarjuna is the man of the Nagas. He's the guy who goes down to the Naga kingdom and brings back the Prajnaparamita Sutras, the great philosopher Nagarjuna. Anyway, so the Nagas are like dragons or snakes or something on the bottom, and then human on top. They live under the sea. They have this big kingdom. And anyway, so at some point the Naga King's daughter, who's this little kid, I mean, she's not even a teenager, she's a little kid, and she's brought up there and in front of the Buddha, and she goes through all these transformations, and she becomes enlightened. But first, for like a millisecond, she has to become male. It just sneaks in there, Okay. Then there's Sudana's pilgrimage in the Avatamsaka Sutra. Where do I have that list? So somewhere here I have a list of Sudana's. There it is. So Sudana, the official count. So this is the last chapter of the Avatamsaka Sutra with this sort of teenage boy and girl are brought between before, I think it's Manjushri, I should know, or maybe it's Maitreya, and they're going to, one of them is going to be sent on a pilgrimage to eventually become a Buddha, and of course we know who it is. It's going to be the boy, right? So he's sent on this pilgrimage, and conventionally he meets 42 teachers, but one of those is actually 2. It's a brother and sister combination, 2 children. So there's actually 43 teachers. 53 together, 53 teachers together, but 21 of them are female. That's not bad. That's almost half. So 21 of them are female, which include 3 children, one of whom is this part of this brother-sister pair, and 1 teenager. So that's very interesting. So Sudana is sent to meet all these enlightened beings who will help wake him up. And let's talk about who they are. One of them is a nun. One of them, this is the most famous one, Vasumitra, is a prostitute. She's a very elegant prostitute, I might add. The very elaborate description. And in Korean, I don't know what you would call it, terminology, she's called Passamillion, because she, slept with a million guys. And the idea is you'd sleep with her, if you're a guy, you'd sleep with her and then you'd be enlightened. And then you wouldn't want to have sex anymore, which made me wonder, why would anyone do that? But anyway, that was the idea that, so she had this enlightenment that she could just, male fantasy. But anyway, it's interesting. a prostitute was one of these teachers. There are 3 female lay devotees. There are 11 goddesses. There's earth goddesses and night goddesses, and one goddess from the 33rd heaven. Most of them are night goddesses. I'm not sure what these goddesses are, but night goddesses are pretty common. And of course, this stuff is coming over from, India. It's sort of in Indian culture is where it's coming from. So anyway, 11 of them are goddesses of one kind or another. One of them is Queen Maya, the mother of the Buddha, the one who gave birth to the Buddha. And then there are these 3 girls, as in prepubescent, and one of them who's and then one who's a teenage girl. So I find that very interesting, that you have these almost half of Sudhana's teachers are female beings. You can't say women because some of them are goddesses, but female beings of one kind or another. Then there's this very interesting sutra, which is hard to find and almost no one ever reads. It's the Sutra of Queen Shramala of the Lion's Roar. And that's actually the sutra that introduces the fundamental teaching that all beings have Buddha nature. And why is this called the Sutra of Queen Shramala of the Lion's Roar? Well, because she essentially is the one who gives this teaching. Buddha kind of gives her a prompt, and then she talks for pages and pages and pages, and Buddha says, just so, very good, correct. Then he gives her another prompt. She goes and goes and goes. So she's basically expounding the sutra. And that's actually very common in the Mahayana sutras, where it's not Buddha talking, but it's other people talking. And even in the Diamond Sutra, where there's back and forth between Buddha and Subhuti, Subhuti says things and Buddha says, just so, good Subhuti, nice boy, So there's this inherent in the Mahayana sutras is this encouragement. Yeah, you are already Buddha. Look at all these, people who are not Buddha, who are expounding Buddhism, and Buddha says, you're great. So there's this very, egalitarian thing in the Mahayana sutras. They really believe all beings have Buddha nature. And then there's the Vimalakirti Sutra. As I said, there are many more, but this is the other one I'm going to give, which is hilarious. So how many of you have read the Vimalakirti Sutra? Okay, so the Vimalakirti Sutra, Vimalakirti is this rich lay guy. And one of the points of the Vimalakirti Sutra is you can be a layperson and still be greatly accomplished in the Dharma. So he's this rich layperson who always defeats the bodhisattvas that try to debate him. Anyone who tries to debate him, whether they're, Ananda, Manjushri, anybody tries to debate him, he just creams. So he gets sick. And the Buddha says, okay, Manjushri, take a bunch of people, go take care of, Vimalakirti's sick, you gotta, help him feel better. And everyone's like, no, I don't want to have anything to do with him because, he's just gonna, cream me and he's gonna make me look like a fool. But Buddha says, okay, you gotta do it. And of course, Vimalakirti ends up making everyone look like a fool. And read the sutra to find out how. But Shariputra is kind of a comic foil in this. He's sort of the fuss budget. He's the person who says, why are all these flowers raining down? It's making a mess. Who's going to clean it up? He's that kind of person. And anyway, he confronts a Devankaya, one of these goddesses, who is showering flowers down in the throng of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and these flowers going down. And he tries to shake the flowers off. And the Devankaya asks him why he does this, and he responds very prissy, well, they are not in a state of suchness. I do not want these flowers in me because they're not in a state of suchness. And the Devankaya points out to him that it is mind differentiating that is causing the problem. And Shariputra realized, oh, I better pay attention to this person. So he says, how long have you been in this room? And she answers cryptically, my stay in this room is just like the venerable elders, i.e. Vimalakirti's liberation. I've been here in this room like the venerable elders' liberation. And Shariputra's clueless. He says, what do you mean? Do you mean you've stayed here for a long time? And the Devankaya is no doubt disgusted by this because she says, does your liberation involve time? So Shariputra is clearly way beyond his depth. He admits he doesn't know what to say, and then the Devankaya expounds on various aspects of liberation. And when Shariputra asks, what have you gained and experienced that gives you such eloquence? She replies, the fact that I neither gain nor experience anything gives me this eloquence. And then expounds the doctrine that there is nothing to attain. And as it turns out, she's been hanging around Vimalakirti for 12 years. And then Shariputra asks her, why do you not change your female bodily form? And she replies, for the last 12 years, I have been looking in vain for a female bodily form. So what do you want me to change? So then they talk about form and illusions. And she says, all phenomena, including forms, are also unreal. And she changes herself into a man and changes Shariputra into a female Devankaya. And he freaks out. And he says, I don't know why I've been turned into a Devankaya. And she lets him stew in his juice and talks for a while. And then she ends by saying, all things are neither male nor female, and turns herself and Shariputra back to normal. And Shariputra has learned his lesson, and he says, the form of a woman neither exists nor is non-existent. And then the Devankaya extends this, likely all things are fundamentally neither existent nor non-existent. And Shariputra asks, not very politely, about her future rebirth and when she will attain enlightenment. And they talk a little bit more, and she explains that enlightenment is not an objective which can be realized. And then Vimalakirti himself praises her. She has, quote, realized the patient endurance of the uncreated and has reached the never-receding bodhisattva stage. In fulfillment of a vow, she appears at will to teach and convert living beings. I love her. But you know what? She's not given a name. You just can't win. Anyway, so yeah. And as I said, there are other sutras with women in them, but those are the four that I wanted to tell you about. Okay.
Judy, I have a question.
Sure.
And I mean, like, I don't know if it's really an answerable question because it's sort of abstract, but, you know, you pointed out that in the Mahayana, there's this belief, there's the view that all beings have Buddha nature. And in the Theravada, they might not talk about Buddha nature, but they do say there's no self. So I think, especially historically, you know, I understand, and even in, you know, the present day, you know, cultural differences between men and women. But to me, the fact that this is even an issue in Buddhism is shocking. You know, that you know, it's shocking that there can even be the question, can women attain awakening? And I think it's, and especially in some sense, like in historical cultures where women and men had such a different place, apparently, in society, I can give a little more latitude. But like in the current day,
I have never heard of a living teacher, or even one in the last 50, 70 years, who has said women cannot attain enlightenment. I have not heard that. There may be some somewhere, but I have not heard that.
I don't know that I've heard that either, but like, I know, I mean, the fact that women still struggle, particularly in the Theravada tradition, you know, like there's Ajahn Brahm. I don't know if you're familiar with that Australian monk, who another American monk, Ajahn Sumedho, has basically attempted to disrobe because he ordained a woman. So it does seem like it is still,
yeah. And I'm not going to comment on any of that except to say it's obviously dumb. I don't understand. I mean, it's the same with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church will not make women priests. It will not allow them to consecrate the host. It will not allow them to lead a mass. What kind of idiocy is that? You look at
But
all the really important, great Catholic women spiritual leaders of the
I
present
guess
day and in
because
history. So it's like, yeah, you're right. There's this stuff is still going on, and yeah, it makes no sense. And that's all you can say is it makes no sense. These guys are idiots.
well, especially it makes no sense in a tradition that basically says, at some level gender is real, but in terms of
Yeah,
gender is really, there might be different.
but there's this twin thing. There's a thing that says it's irrelevant, and then there's this thing that says that the little Naga girl has to quickly become a male before she can, reach final, liberation. So it's like you have both of these things going on at the same time, and the question is which is going to take precedence in which time and in which place. So you have like this one, women's temple in Nepal where these nuns are vital, and they are, they kick ass, literally, Kung Fu nuns, and they help the people around them, and they have this strong, strong spiritual practice. And then, 100 or so miles down the road, you have this small village where this, girl has to live her life, serving the monastery and being not receiving a decent Buddhist education. She doesn't know that they're four noble truths and not three. So yeah, these things coexist. There's always work to be done. And I can't say that it makes sense because it doesn't make sense. It's just somebody's idea. There's a famous thing where in our school where Barbara Rhodes, who's the head of our school, and when she was a new student, she asked Zen Master Songsan, can a woman become a Zen master? And he said no, and she was shocked. And he said a man cannot become a Zen master either. So if you're thinking in those terms, you can't be a Zen master. You have to cut through. So yeah, yeah, yeah. It's aggravating. It's terrible, but that's how it is. Yeah, yeah. So thank you for pointing it out. Yeah, Austin, you have your hand raised.
Yes, I actually wanted to, because Ajahn Brahm was mentioned. He saved my life in 2013. His teachings did, and actually what brought me to practice. So he's the one that ordained the Pakuni and got in all that trouble.
Mhm.
Anyway, the question I wanted to ask was, I mean, clearly there's been a lot of injustice around sex in Buddhism, and I'm wondering if there's any record of attempts to right that injustice throughout history. Is there a saga of rebelling nuns who said, no, this isn't right? Is there any of that?
The way that you write that particular kind of wrong, you don't have to have the nuns rebel. You simply have to have them live their lives of integrity and practice, and do it in a way that has that is independent. That's how it's done. I mean, that's how it was done in Korea. That's how it was done in China. And then in the places where women were not able to have full ordination in the late 20th century, what you had was women who insisted on practicing. Some of them Western, some of them from the culture. They just insisted on practicing whether you made them a nun or not. There's a very famous uh, woman from, oh, and now I'm forgetting, I think she's from Myanmar. She wrote a book called Pure and Simple, and I will quickly look it up while I'm talking, and I'll tell you her name. Oh, we've got the book there. Okay. What's her name? You're not. Okay, we've got Shuang.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear you. Okay, so it's Upasika, which means
Upatika,
ki
Upatika, Ki,
nanayan.
Nanayan.
And Upasika is actually a title, and what it means is honored layperson, honored laywoman. And she simply built herself a place and started teaching. You know, she didn't lead a rebellion. She just built herself a place and started teaching and attracted people around her. And that's how it's usually done, is you have just women go and do it. You know, they just go and do it, and then they support their sisters. So that's how it usually happens. Or like Mangang telling Song Gyong that, letting her be his student and then supporting her in that. So it's sort of, generally it's internal. You have these women who are really strong, and you have these people who are supporting them, either male or female. And that's usually how it happens. So, yeah. And where was she from again?
She's Thai.
Thai. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So she's a good place to start from, because I was about to talk about laywomen. She was a laywoman. Okay. So again, you have the fourfold Sangha. You know, these four things are important: monks, nuns, laymen, laywomen. The Sangha is not complete without four of them. Laymen, women were prominent as practitioners from and patrons. That's very important. Giving money to the temple man, that is really important. From the time of the Buddha. Because of expectations about marriage and children, many women who did become nuns did so later in life, after they had fulfilled their family obligations. One of the examples is Miao Tsung, who I'll talk about. In Korea, and I think also in China, there were these sort of aristocratic women's temples within the palace. So it would be like a place that encouraged women's practice, and women would live nun-like lives, and some of them might even have taken full ordination, all within the palace. Women were often praised in sermons by male monks, but this was double-edged. And it was double-edged because the idea would be, the point of the sermon would be, here's this woman and she's done all these amazing things. What's wrong with you monks that you can't do it too? You know? And the tea house lady, you know, the trope of the tea house lady, you know, the monk who thinks he's really hot stuff, he comes down and he really needs some tea, he needs some lunch, and the tea house lady challenges him. Doksan is the most famous example. I am the great Diamond Sutra master, ask me any question. And she says, oh, okay, Diamond Sutra, very interesting. If you answer my question, your lunch is free. Otherwise, you don't get anything. Oh, ask me anything. I am great, And so she's, okay. Diamond Sutra says, past mind cannot be grasped, present mind cannot be grasped, future mind cannot be grasped. With what mind will you eat your lunch? And he goes, He doesn't get his lunch. He asks who his teacher is. She tells him. He goes up the mountain. He becomes a Zen master. Okay, so the point of that tea house lady is not, oh, this old lady is so wise. The point is, even an old lady can defeat Doksan. It's a double-edged thing. So, I look at her and say, ooh, cool. But at the time, it was like, even an old lady can defeat this guy. So he's not so hot. So anyway, that's the trope of the tea house lady. I want to talk about some individuals now. I want to talk about 4 women of the Tang and Sung dynasty. Is it okay if we go on until noon? Because it looks like we might. Okay. Let's see. Page 7. Oh, there we go. So, okay. Everyone knows about Huike, the guy that Bodhidharma gave transmission to. He also had 3 other students, and one of them was a woman. So this is very interesting. This is the nun Tsung Chi. And when Bodhidharma was about to return to India, he asked his 4 top students to state their realization. And Tao Fu said, the Buddha's path transcends language, but is not separate from it. And Bodhidharma said, you have attained my skin. Tsung Chi, the woman, said it was like seeing one of the Buddha lands. If you see it once, you never see it again. You never need to see it again. And Bodhidharma said, you have attained my flesh. Dao Yu said that the 4 elements are originally empty and 5 aggregates not existent, so nothing that he comprehends is attainable. And Bodhidharma said, you have attained my bone. And Huika simply bowed, and Bodhidharma said, you have attained my marrow. So she got some kind of recognition, this nun, one of the 4 major students of Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma. So right at the beginning of Chan, there was a woman. Ling Chao, the daughter of Layman Pang. He was a very famous lay practitioner. He appears in the lineage charts. He's kind of a Tang version of Vimalakirti, except he wasn't rich. He gave away all his stuff. Well, he sank all his possessions in the river, left his wife and son on the farm, and wandered through China with his daughter. They lived by choice in great poverty. There's an extensive record of Layman Pang's Dharma combat, but very little about Ling Chao, and even less about her brother. But here are 2 stories. So one of them is a visitor asked Layman Pang whether Zen is easy or difficult. He says it's very difficult, like trying to scatter sesame trees over a tree. The visitor walks a little further and asks his wife. She says, oh, it's easy, like touching your feet to the ground when you get out of bed. The visitor walks a little further, sees Ling Chao, and asks the same questions. Version of her responses differ, but here's one. Not difficult, not easy. When hungry, eat. When tired, sleep. I always thought I like the version where it's like touching your nose with your finger. Well, that's one story. And in any story in which Ling Chao is in, she always beats everyone in Dharma combat. She always wins, So there's another story. Layman Pang is old, he's ready to die, and he says to Ling Chao, see how high the sun is and report to me when it's noon. So she knows what's going on. She goes outside, says, Father, come quick, it's an eclipse. So he goes to look, she hops in the bed, sits with her hands in Apchang, and dies. He comes back, sees her, and exclaims, my daughter beat me to it. And then he stays alive another 7 days to observe the funeral rites. This is such a weird story. Kids don't do this at home, But anyway, there's Ling Chao, gets the last word. Moshan Liaoran. So this is very interesting. She was the first woman to appear in the lineage chart and was considered one of the major teachers of her time, late 8th and early 9th century, end of the Tang Dynasty. She was a contemporary of Lin Chi. Her male student Guanxi Xian famously declared, I received half a ladle at Father Lin Chi's place and half a ladle at Mother Moshan's. Since I took that drink, I've never been thirsty. So people would go back and forth from teacher to teacher, and in particular, Lin Chi and Moshan. Moshan's name means summit mountain, and this gives a context to the following dialogue, which records Guanxi's meeting with the woman who became his teacher. Moshan asked, where did you come from? And he responded, I left the entrance to the road. This is a very good answer. He didn't say I came from Paris or Moscow. He said, I left the entrance to the road. But she's not satisfied. Why didn't you block it? She said. And he had no answer and bowed in acknowledgement. Then he asked, what is Moshan, remember means summit mountain, like? She said, its peak isn't visible. What sort of person lives there? He asked. Not with male or female form, she replied. Guanxi shouted, Cuts! And asked, why don't you transform yourself? And Moshan answered, I am not a fox spirit. So fox spirits are these shape changers, shapeshifters in East Asian, Northeast Asian mythology. I am not a fox spirit. Why should I transform myself? And then Guanxi became her student. So that's Moshan. Miao Tsong was one of the women that was given authorization by Dao Wei. Dao Wei was the great formalizer of the Kong'an system. So Miao Tsong was born into a wealthy family. As a teenager, she was ignorant of Chan, but she had a great insight. And she thought everyone else had great insights, so she didn't bother mentioning to anyone. She married someone against her will, began practicing on her own. She had several encounters with various Chan masters in which she basically blew them away. Still a laywoman, remember she had these family obligations, she took lay precepts with Dawi and sat a summer retreat during which she fully awakened. She was recognized as a teacher while still a laywoman and did not become a nun until quite old. So here's her first part of her first encounter with Dawi's teacher, Master Yuan. Yuan greeted her by saying, "How can you, a protected lady from a wealthy family, be prepared for the business of a great hero?" She replied, "Does the Buddha Dharma distinguish between male and female forms?" Yuan then asked her, "What is the Buddha? The mind is the Buddha. What about you?" She said, "I've heard of you for a long time, but you still say that kind of thing." So she was fearless, but not quite ripe. So it was only when Dao Wei gave a speech, which Miao Tsung's husband, very high government official, commanded him to give, which quoted Shi Tu's line, "This way won't do, not this way won't do, this way and not this way, both won't do," that Miao Tsung fully awakened and was acknowledged by Dao Wei. So this is very interesting. So there was clearly a kind of ambivalence about upper class women doing serious practice, about taking them seriously, but she just plowed her way through it. And if someone proved themselves worthy, even if they were a woman, they were acknowledged very happily. The most famous story about Miao Tsung occurred when she was still a laywoman. She was practicing at Daoi's temple and was lodged in the abbot's quarters. The head monk disapproved. "What's this rich lady doing in your quarters?" So Daoi told him to go interview her. So the head monk showed up and Miao Tsung asked him, "Is this a Dharma interview or a worldly interview?" The head monk said, "A Dharma interview." Miao Tsung told him to send his attendants away and went into the room. When she called him in, he saw her lying face up on the bed, naked. He pointed at her womb, he's not afraid either, and said, "What kind of place is this?" She replied, "All the Buddhas of the 3 worlds, the 6 patriarchs, all the great monks everywhere, they all come from here." The head monk said, "Will you let me enter or not?" She replied, "It allows horses to cross. It does not allow asses to cross." And then she kicked him out. It's a great story. When she was a nun, she was known for keeping the precepts very strictly and leading a life of great austerity. The governor of Jiangsu province ordered her to leave her life of seclusion to become the abbot and teacher of a women's temple, which she did. But then she asked permission to retire, which was granted, and she went back to practicing in seclusion. So she was quite something. So those are 4 women from the Tang and Sung dynasties. And then let's see, we have 2 women from the Chan records. What is that? No, they're already there. I don't see what that is. Oh, yeah. Well, one of them we've already met. That's the tea house lady, and the other one is the nun Jinsei, which means true world. So this is about Guji Zen Master. So Guji was a very famous sutra master, and one day he was studying the sutras when his light was blocked by a tall nun wearing her large straw traveling hat. So this is very interesting. Remember the 8 rules? So this woman is traveling on her own. She's completely independent. You know, she's got one of those sticks that they used when they were traveling. They had the rings at the top. That was to scare tigers away. You banged your stick in the ground and made a noise, and then the tigers wouldn't bother you or something. But this woman blocks his light, and she's standing in front of him. You know, she doesn't bow, she doesn't do anything. She just stands there blocking his light, and this is incredibly rude. And she doesn't even remove her hat. So she walks around Guji 3 times, you know, hitting her staff each time. And then she spoke, "If you can give me one word, I will remove your hat." Guji's a sutra master. He doesn't know what to do. So he's just stunned. He doesn't say anything. The nun turns to leave. And then realizing it was getting late and the path is dangerous, he asks her to spend the night at his temple. And she repeats, "If you can give me one word, I will spend the night." And he didn't know what to say. So she left. And just as with Doksan being asked about with what mind will you eat your lunch, he's completely shaken. He realized that all his sutra training meant nothing. He dismissed his attendants and he turned to the path of Zen. Unfortunately, he was visited by a great Zen master, I think 2 days later, and immediately attained enlightenment. He should have done some hard training, you know? He really should have. But anyway, that's the story. So that's women as supporting characters. And there are a few women that appear in the Kongans. Not many, but there are a few that do appear. Let me make a quick trip to Japan. So Dogen was explicitly supportive of women. I mean, he stated, let's see, I think I have a quote in my big paper, out somewhere. He said, Dogen said, oh yeah, he was talking about China, and he talked about, so this is 13th century, he says, he's approving of the nuns having high status in China. He says, if one of them has a reputation of acquiring the Dharma, the court will grant an edict appointing an abbot of a nunnery. She will immediately go up to the Dharma hall in the monastery to give a lecture. All the monks will attend, stand erect, will listen to expound the Dharma. The monks will put the questions. This has been the rule since ancient times. So the idea of women preaching to men, he was A-okay with that. He thought it was great. So he was a big champion of women. Actually, in China, it wasn't as good as he thought it was, but okay. Hakuin was very interesting because he didn't explicitly write about women, but he did support them. He had major women students. He gave transmission to women. So he was a very different kind of support, sort of real, on the ground support. The most famous of women, his students, is student Satsujo. And the story is, as a young girl, very similar to Mao Tsung, she had an experience, attained enlightenment, and being fully awakened, she's like 7 or 8 years old, she starts, in front of her little shrine in her little room, she's sitting on the sutras. And her parents discover, because they're not special, she knows the sutras are not special. So her parents discover this, and they're very upset, so they bring her to the local Zen master. And he realized that she has deep attainment, but he says, not everyone is going to understand this. So maybe you should keep it quiet and just live a good life. And she's okay. So, but everyone knew she was highly accomplished. And not formally, and she was Hakuin's student. And while not formally a teacher, she taught informally, the same way that Layman Pong and Ling Chao did. When her granddaughter died and she wept, people questioned her attainment, at which point she stopped weeping long enough to say, "My tears are not for me, but for my granddaughter." And in between her childhood and old age, there are various details of her accounts with her teacher or other practitioners, and in most of these encounters, she comes out on top, whatever that means. Zen Master Sung San retells the story as if she's the student of Master Matsu, and gives her the name Suol, but she was actually a student of Hakuin in Japan, and her name was Satsujo. And then there's the nun Ryonen Genso. So Ryonen Genso was born into a noble family in 1646. Her life was typical of the life of the nobility, a stint at court as a child, studied calligraphy and poetry, arranged marriage, children. In 1672, her husband permitted her to become a nun in the Obaku school, which is a combination of Zen and Pure Land. It's the smallest of the Zen sects in Japan. It's considered heretical because it's a combination with Pure Land by many Rinzai and Soto teachers. So she's at a women's temple, and the women were not given the same opportunities as the men for practice and study. And so she was not satisfied this. by this. So she asked 2 different male teachers to admit her as a student, and both refused on the grounds, and this brings us back to the very beginning of the class, that her beauty would disturb the monks. So at the second refusal, she heated an iron, I guess there was an iron sitting there, and pressed it against her face, burned her face, and said, "Will you admit me now?" And they did. She became her teacher's leading student, a great teacher in her own right, and an abbot of her own temple. And she was a great and famous calligrapher. So she did a calligraphy of a poem that she wrote about her mutilation of her face. And I will read you the poem. The poem is, "Formerly, to amuse myself at court, I would burn orchid incense. Now, to enter the Zen life, I burn my own face. The 4 seasons pass by naturally like this, but I don't know who I am amidst the change. In this living world, the body I give up and burn would be wretched if I thought of myself as anything but firewood." So there was an exhibition of Zen art, including calligraphy, at the Spencer Museum in Lawrence, maybe like 20, 25 years ago, organized by Steve Addis. And this calligraphy was there. And standing in front of this calligraphy, when you stand in front of a work of art, it's made by a human being. A human being touched that. And this calligraphy, she composed and wrote. Her brush touched this paper. This was like a direct transmission. Art is always a direct transmission of the artist to the viewer. And I stood in front of that, and I wanted to touch it. I couldn't because it was in a museum. But that this palpable evidence of her life and her experience was right in front of me. It was one of the most powerful moments of my life. So I had to tell you about that. Yeah. So that's Myonin Gatso. Let's go to Korea. We're almost done. 17th century Shilla kingdom, Queen Sondak becomes a devout Buddhist. That's when Buddhism comes to Korea. So at that point, there are 3 kingdoms. One of them is the Shilla kingdom, and a queen, and I don't mean the wife of a king, I mean a queen. At the time of almost constant warfare, but she did a good job, and the Shilla kingdom kept intact. The next 2 rulers of the Shilla kingdom were also women. This was a golden age of Buddhist and Korean culture. The Goryeo dynasty followed 10th to 14th century, also a period of Buddhist flowering. Buddhism was practiced at court. Many women students of the great teacher Hye Sin, who explicitly said you do not need a man's body to be enlightened. Many aristocratic Korean Buddhist women were sent to China to marry aristocratic Chinese men. That's what diplomacy was. You send this woman from this family to marry this man from this family, and then you got to get along, right? And these Korean women had a very strong influence on Buddhism in the Yuan dynasty court. That's late 13th to mid 14th century. In fact, the Chinese Empress Qi was in fact Korean. Now, she was the empress, as in the wife of the emperor. She wasn't independent, but she was in fact Korean. But then there was a catastrophe when Buddhism was suppressed in the early Chosun period, when Confucians became ascendant. So as I said, monastics are always a threat. They're too independent. Buddhism is always a threat. It's too egalitarian. Gender separation and gender roles became very strict. Upper-class women endured a kind of purda where they couldn't leave the house unless, they had male company. They had to, hide their bodies and everything like that. Howsoever, in all this Buddhist suppression, what do you do with widows? Widows are not supposed to remarry. Answer, you put them in the women's temples. So Buddhism survived in the women's temples because you needed the women's temples to take care of the extra women that you didn't know what to do with. So that was kind of interesting. So they become Buddhist nuns, and the nuns' temples were built on some of the nuns' temples were built on aristocratic estates, which were owned by men who were actually suppressing Buddhism. So that's interesting, you know? So you had the simultaneous severe repression of the male monastic sangha and the toleration and even tacit encouragement of the women's monastic sangha made the women relatively independent of the men. So it turned out to be kind of a good thing in a way. The contemporary Korean nun sangha is one of the most stable and one of the most longest lasting women's sanghas of the Buddhist world. It's lasted for over 1,500 years. I'm going to skip to Kyung Ho in the late 19th century. He's my great-great-grandfather. His revival of Buddhism included something similar to contemporary Western Zen centers, men and women, lay and monastic, living and practicing together. It didn't last, but he tried. And as I mentioned, because the Japanese forced many male monks to marry, while nuns were still forbidden to do so, this gave the nuns a lot of credibility in the reformation of the Choge order. But as I said, in the early 19th and late 19th and early 20th century, the nuns had very little training. The younger ones were basically servants to the older ones, but then this began to change. And now contemporary Korean nuns receive extremely rigorous training, communal. They all sleep in a big room together, the novices, that is. The novices work long hours. There's no privacy. There's various levels of ordination. All nuns train together in the beginning. After full ordination, which takes 4 years, you can specialize. You can be a meditation nun. You can be a social working nun. You can be an academic nun. And while Jogye is officially a Linchi school, it is syncretic, and some of its monastics tends more to like Pure Land or something like that, or YN. Nuns' temples are still essentially independent of monks' temples. Let's see, scandals in the Chogi order gave lay people more power, and particularly lay women. Lay women who are active practitioners are called Bosal Nims. The men are called Gosal Nims. Lay practice is encouraged, but there are limits. No lay person can teach a monk. And I have some stories about that, but we're running out of time, so I won't tell you. Some lay people, both men and women, have some kinds of authorization, but they can only teach other lay people. Our school in Korea is a counterweight to this, and as I said, sometimes they don't know what to do with us. Let's see. Then I have this note about 3 Korean nuns and one not quite a nun. I don't know, I've just been rambling on and on and on and on. So yeah, there have been major nuns in Korea. I don't really feel like I need to talk about them because you get the idea. So I think I'll stop there and ask about questions.
I have a question.
Sure.
Okay. I always have, well, to kind of Anne's point, you know, even with Dogen,
Mm-hmm.
of course, my experience in Soto Zen is what I'm finding out to be a little limited, but and not representative of all Soto Zen. Yet there's always you know, anytime the issue was brought up of women, it was always, well, Dogen says women can be enlightened.
Mm-hmm.
It always gave the impression of it wasn't inherent that women can be enlightened, and that it's that Dogen said it could happen. So since Dogen says it can, yeah, we're okay with women being teachers and being enlightened. You know, so it's this it's this patriarchy that is there and ingrained in our society, and I don't think it's ever going to go away, but I'm more of a pessimistic person, probably not in my lifetime. And we can say, well, yeah, but it's a lot better, but it's cool things that then embed, I think, and then along with the stories, and even one Sunday, the story of, the monk who helps the woman across that's a sexist story. And yet we still continue to tell the stories. And I wanted to say something, but then it makes me feel like I'm saying, I didn't really like your talk because you told a story.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to do that, yet because I didn't do that, I also contributed to this little seed being planted in everybody's mind that women need help to cross a river. And maybe she did need help. Easily said the story. You could have easily said, and he asked, ma'am, do you need help? And let her answer whether she needs help. Maybe she did.
Okay, so let me remind everyone of the story. It's the story of these two monks come to a river. There's a woman, as Liz says, helpless woman standing there in her fine clothes. She can't cross the river. So one monk picks her up, carries her across, put her down. The other monk, they go on. The other monk hours later says to her, how could you do that? How could you, pick up this woman? We're not supposed to touch women. And so the senior monk says, I put her down a long time ago. You're still holding her. So as Liz points out, what is this trope of the helpless woman? Yeah, so I will tell you a story about that. So Zen Master Sung-san used to tell this story about some woman whose car breaks down, has a flat tire, and she can't change a tire. And she's wearing fancy clothes and high heels, and she can't change a tire. So some guy has to come along and change her tire. I forget what the point of it was. It wasn't about touching a woman. It was some other point. And you really used to piss me off. Just as Liz says, like I knew how to change a tire, and I didn't care if my clothes got dirty if I had to change a tire. It was like, what is this bullshit? And so this was before I had a kid. So I would he'd come to Kansas and I'd practice with him, and maybe I'd go to Providence for a ceremony and practice with him. And this was on a retreat in Colorado, and I wanted to go out to Berkeley and practice with him. And this was a retreat in Colorado. And at this point, I'd heard this story 3 or 4 times in 3 or 4 different places, and I was really sick of it. And so he tells the story, and I raised my hand and said something about it, and he just, flips it away. And then, he leaves, and we go back to sitting, and I am furious. I'm just fuming. I am completely furious sitting at this story. And I'm just sitting there, he's so sexist. Why does he do this? Why, blah, blah, blah. I'm going on and on and on like this. And my mind is just, I can't, that's all I can think of. And the minute the stick is hit to do walking meditation, I am out of there. I mean, I don't even wait to take my place in line, and get to the door. I'm just out of there. And I go find him, and he's teaching calligraphy to somebody, and, like being very, whatever. And I fling the door open. I said, why do you tell this story about this woman? He stands up, he says, I never made women! Like that. So my mind was trapped. So that's really important, that we can get sucked in. Yeah, it's a sexist trope. The idea of the helpless woman is a sexist trope, and it's important to recognize that. And it doesn't hurt to say, that's kind of a sexist trope. Not all women are helpless. Maybe next time I hear that story, I'll remember to say that. Okay? But then if we go over and over and over in our mind, then we're caught in it. And it's like we're letting it take over our mind, and there's no need to do that. But yeah, call it out. Call it out. You're right. It is a sexist trope, and there's no need to tell it that way. There's no need to tell it that way. But and it's good to point that out, but also it's good to not get trapped in letting that take over one more inch of our mental real estate than it deserves, which is very little. So yeah.
Yeah, and yes, but you know, I and so I'm going to go ahead and mention this.
Yeah.
No, I not too long ago I saw some reruns of Adam 12, which was this cop show,
Hmm.
60s, early 70s, and I was astounded at the amount of racism in it.
Yeah.
However, and I used to, as a kid, which I would have been at the age of where I was watching a lot of TV,
Hmm.
thought to myself, I saw all this crap.
Hmm.
I saw that, and I didn't see it as racist.
That's right. Yeah.
Also a lot of sexism in it too, but it was the
Mhm.
racism that really got me. And I thought, and I never saw that then.
Yeah, it's important to see it.
Yeah, but I think of all that stuff that was in my head,
Hmm.
stuff put in my head, and I
Yeah.
guess that that is what bothers me. The sexism and the patriarchy, and you can go into the stories about it's heterosexual. There is no pass a million guy,
Yeah. Right.
million woman.
And there's no non-binary.
Yeah, well, pass a million woman only sleeps with men.
Right,
So
but I'm not talking about sex, I'm talking about gender. I'm saying there's no non-binary, there's no trans, except for the somewhat genderless appearance of the bodhisattvas. Right, yeah.
and so all that stuff is being put
Hmm.
in people's heads, and
Yeah.
and and so I guess that's what uh I didn't see with the story, whereas at one time I would have, don't get me wrong,
Hmm.
but I
Hmm.
didn't, and I didn't have trouble not asking the question
Hmm.
or point. um but but I guess I just don't see Buddhism changing. And maybe that's the whole point. Maybe I just need to know that it's not going to change, because we aren't going to change the stories. Dogen, by some people, Dogen is always going to be this, oh, women can get enlightened. Dogen says it's okay. So if Dogen says it's okay, then it's okay with me. There's always that.
So the mind that says it's written somewhere and therefore it's okay, that mind is problematic. It's our direct experience. It's not what somebody says in a book. It's our direct experience. It's not what somebody says in a talk. It's our direct experience that's important. So you had this direct experience of the sexism of the story, the trope of the helpless woman. You have this direct experience of it. That's what's important. And then, you say nothing's going to change, but I'm a Zen teacher. I'm lay and I'm female and I'm a Zen teacher. So something's changed. Now, in the past, maybe there were lay female teachers and then there weren't anymore. So I'm not saying that, things always get better and better and better. They clearly don't. You just have to look at Ukraine. That's really clear. You have to look at Hungary. It's really clear. Things don't get better and better and better all the time. Things go back and forth and circle around and so on and so forth. But the fact is, things do change. And whoever is alive at that time is necessarily part of that change, whether they're going along with it or fighting it or whatever. And sometimes it changes simultaneously in opposite ways, you know? So don't let the bastards get you down. It doesn't matter what somebody says about women's capabilities. It doesn't matter what somebody says about lay people. It doesn't matter. You just practice. Just practice, practice, practice. Do your practice. And yeah, call it out when you see it. Doesn't hurt to call it out when you see it. And I'm sorry that I didn't. I should have, because I hate that trope. So I should have said something. And I apologize for not saying it. If there's a next time, I hope I remember. I can't promise, but I hope I remember. But yeah, just it's being strong in our practice. That's the thing. And the other thing is, when we're looking at these things of who becomes famous and who, becomes authorized and who has administrative power, and who, whatever that thing is. Ultimately, we all are born and we all die, and ultimately that stuff is bullshit. It's not important. What's important is how we live our life right now, how our mind is right now. That's what's important. So yeah, call out the bullshit, absolutely. But don't let it control you. That's really important. Don't let it control you. You just act in the moment, and you practice and you practice and you practice, which will enable you to act in the moment. That's very, very important. Does that make sense? Yeah, thank you. And does that somehow respond to what you were saying?
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is like one of the most interesting parts of the conversation, because I feel like what I heard from Liz was like this sort of subtle stuff is actually pernicious in its subtlety.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I hear what you're saying too, and I think that's like the ultimate lesson of practice, is that we have to take responsibility. And all the messaging that we get that we're this person with these limitations is like the challenge of practice to, notice our capacity for awakening.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think I mean, I think in this whole discussion of women in Buddhism, I think a big question I also have is, like, on the one hand, the suggestion that, women are limited, like that's been historical and is still, I think, there in subtle ways, is important. And then I think, so, I mean, and when I hear that, I want to say, it's like enrages me, basically. I mean, and the part that it enrages is it's just not rational. I mean, but on the other hand, I think an important part of the discussion in my last Sangha, something that I was instrumental in was bringing in a women's lineage to our chanting. And it was really important to me. And I think, so that on the other side, like, I think as a woman, and then of course the question of non-binary is also in there, but as a woman, I feel like I've heard women say, there's no gender, it doesn't matter. And I feel like that's true at one hand, but on the other hand, I feel like it's important to me to have women role models.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like something that you actually say in your paper is, you say, women's Dharma combat is just as powerful. Women in the Linchi tradition shouted and gave blows just as the men did. Whether this is a matter of capitulation to a male model or a refusal to be limited by female stereotypes is a matter of opinion. And I feel like some question for me in my practice now is like, it's so hard to use the language, but like where masculine models are repressive or something like that, or like I feel like one thing I've encountered in my own practice is male teachers telling me that my emotions are problematic. And I think emotions can be problematic, but I feel like oftentimes it's gaslighting.
Yes.
Who are afraid of women and who are afraid of women's anger and women's boundaries, telling me that I'm a problem. So I feel like this question of patriarchy, and I'm hesitant to say that because like not all males are like that, and it's not a question of really so much men and women, but like problematic patriarchal models, whether they're historical or present day, or problematic masculine models that like are they kill at some level.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. Like I said, there's also this gaslighting that you run into. But the thing about these severe forms of patriarchy, they're not everywhere. So yeah, there's some places that it's really ridiculous. Because that's what it is. It's actually ridiculous. I mean, it's painful because it's terrible pain, because it's terrible damage. But if you lift yourself up a bit, you can see that it's actually ridiculous. It makes no sense. But then there are other places that are not like that. So, you have a choice. You can go to the places where it's not like that. You can do what you can in the place where it is like that, or you can decide I shouldn't even bother with this because there's this other thing. There's this thing of examples. Like I said, whose question was it about women rising up? In the history of Buddhism, there isn't this thing of women rising up. There's just this thing of women doing it and doing it and doing it until finally people say, "Oh my God, they're doing it." So that's sort of the model of that we're kind of in. And the patriarchy is insidious, it's pernicious, it's destructive. And what can we do to not succumb? Charlie.
Yeah, but the thing that really sticks with me is the essence of our practice is to break through that wall of self.
Yeah.
What you're talking about in that, and I think that this is the thing that's key, is that whatever we learn that's limiting and inhibiting us is something we have to punch through in that way.
It's actually not break through the wall of self. It's actually breaking the wall of self.
Breaking it. Okay.
Just break it.
Yeah, break it. Okay.
Yeah, but what Anne is referring to is the thing that limits, the situation where the opportunity is not there to do it. The institutions are not supporting you to do it. The institutions are telling you you're incapable of doing it. How dare you even think of doing it? That's what Anne is talking about. And that's the pernicious thing. And then, there are places where it's not like that. Sure. Yeah. Kyle. Oh, why were female patrons important? Because they were rich. Male patrons and female patrons, they were rich. It's very simple. That's why they were important. Okay? Julie.
I guess I have a really obvious point, but to me, it just seems so ridiculous, the central part of our practice of no self, and yet all this patriarchy going on in the way Buddhism is practiced. And it's just like, it's so amazing. It's like gender still played a huge role in how you can practice Buddhism and all of that. And yet it's like gender is a part of ourself, and yet it just can have so much effect in limiting and the patriarchy, and yet all the while it's still there, like no self, but gender is important. If you're a nun, you can't do this, or you have to have more rules, and I just find it so incredibly ridiculous.
Yep. Me too. I want to amend one thing that Anne said. Anne said it's important for women to have female role models. I'd add that it's important for men to have female role models too. Because that's how you break out of the patriarchal mindset, is you understand that, men don't have everything, that other people can have the same thing. So, yeah, right. Anything else?
Great class. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I wonder, now that we're more aware of like trans issues and non-binary, I don't know how these issues play out. I have very little sensitivity to that. So I just wanted to mention that this is like another dimension to look at, aside from the binary male female. This is another dimension that needs to be looked at. And our particular school and our actual individual sangha is very LGBTQ friendly, as these things go. but it's just something I think people need to look at. That's all I'll say. So thank you, everybody. Yeah, something else? Yeah.
I was gonna say, since it was relatively recent that the song I was in was having the discussion about including the female lineage chart, we actually talked about non-binary, and
Mhm.
what we talked about was like there is no history that we know of anyway of like the categories of non-binary. So in terms of like historically, it's actually hard to know,
Right.
at least on the surface, it's hard to know how to include that in history because it
Mhm.
doesn't, it's not as apparent.
Except for the iconography of the bodhisattvas,
Yeah, that's
which is interesting. Yeah. So thank you, everybody. We can stop recording. Thank you. Bye-bye.